Alright, in this presentation we're going to look at loops, specifically what we call conditional loops. So the two types of loops that we'll be utilizing in Python are going to be for loops and while loops. Now the whole purpose of a loop is to repeat a block of code that we have configured, and it will repeat as long as this Boolean expression is going to be true. So some kind of condition that we set up is going to be true. And it is a repetitive execution of the same block, and this code is going to be referred to as an iteration. So if we take a look at what iteration components are going to be. So one, we have a definite iteration, so we have a number of specified repetitions that is executed. So typically this is done with some kind of list, and we'll get into what lists are in a moment there. And we also have an indefinite iteration, so it executes until some kind of condition is met. So it really depends on the scenario of what we're trying to accomplish. So let's take a look at for loops. For loops are designed to work better in a sequence type of events. So if we take a look at the code, the flow chart here, so we have a test expression that we're going to evaluate, and if that test expression happens to be true, then it's going to execute this body of loop and keep on doing it until the condition is false. After it's false, it breaks out of the loop and continues on with other components. So if we're looking at a simple code, so we're starting out with our for statement. We have some kind of variable that we end up utilizing, and this basically would be a list. We'll get into lists a little bit later on, and we have a colon that is after that. So anytime we utilize a for, we need to enter a colon, and then we're going to execute the block of code, and the indentation is back at the line up over here, so that continues on with the rest of the code. Alright, so we'll get more specific examples as we get through a specific problem. So a while loop is also going to execute a set of statements while the condition is true. So slight little difference with this configuration compared to the for statement. Now depending on how your while loop is going to be structured, sometimes you're going to need some kind of initiation statement for this particular test expression. We'll also look at different scenarios where we don't need to have an actual initiation statement of a variable. But if we do, we're going to test the expression, and while the condition is true, it's going to execute the body of loop. And depending on how we have things structured, we may need to have some kind of update statement or some kind of parameter to either break out of the loop or something along those lines. So then it basically continues looping around. So once the expression then is false, it's exiting out of the loop and continues on with the rest of the statements. So if we take a look at a simple snippet of code, so here is our while statement, here is some kind of test expression, and then again we end up with a colon, and here we have once again the indentations to indicate that this is the block of code for this while statement. And then anything else that is not indented, that is after the while loop. So another thing that we're able to implement is a function referred to as range. So when we take a look at the range function, what it does is generates a sequence of numbers. It's going to start out with 0 by default, and we're going to look at the syntax here. And also by default is going to increment by 1. And then stops, and here's the important one, before a specific number that we evaluated. So if we take a look at the syntax of range, so this is the command. We're going to have our open and close parentheses, and the only thing that's required is the stop, because then by default Our start value is going to be at 0 by default, so we don't need to put it in unless we're specifying a specific value that we're starting up. And also our step value is also optional if we're incrementing by 1. So we can change these things very easily. So in this particular example, when I have range of 10, that means that it's going to start at 0 and go all the way up to 9. So from 0 to 9, those are 10 basically values that it's going to cycle through. So again, we'll take a look at actual programming code to see how that particular element works. Let's take a look at an example of utilizing range. So here we end up utilizing a variable for the n range, which happens to be 5. And we're also initiating another variable for the sum, which we're registering as 0. And utilizing a for loop. So this variable we're just utilizing, I mean, we could utilize, x or I, or it doesn't really matter, because this is going to cycle through the numbers. Meaning that for number n, now here's our function range, and this is the n range, and you notice that we're also including +1, so it's going to actually go up to 6. Since our value is 5, it's going to go up to 6. Now this one here, if you remember from our calculations lab, what this is doing is evaluating if the number here, because it's going to start out with 0, if the number divided by 2 is equal to 0, meaning that if this is true, then add the sum to the number that's there. So this is evaluating if the number happens to be even. And it's going to cycle through until the end of the range. And after it's all completed, until it reaches basically 6, then it's outside of the loop, and then it'll utilize this print statement. Now another iteration of this is we have a start range, and then we also include the end range. So slight difference here. So for num in range, and we're utilizing start range, because by default this would be 0, but we're specifying now that this is going to be 1 over here. And the same thing as before, it's going to end at 1 greater than what we specify here. And same thing, it's going to test out to see if the even number is. If it is, we're going to add the number together and then print out a statement. So again, once we start doing some little bit more coding, we'll take a look at that in much greater detail. Now, there's going to be situations where we're going to end up utilizing a break, a continue, or a pass, and let's quickly evaluate what these components mean. So let's take a look at break real quick. Break will alter the flow of a loop, terminate the loop that it is in, and if it's in a nested loop, it will terminate the innermost loop. So we could, just like the if statements, we're able to nest loops as well. So I got a program that we'll be doing that will have a nested loop as well. So we enter a loop, we have a test expression. From there we have another test that we're doing, and if that condition happens to be true, then it'll break out of the program. If not, then it will continue with the body of the loop, and this will loop around until it's false or until it breaks out. So if we take a look at this portion here, let's take a look at this snippet of code. So we're entering a loop, so for x and sequence, and again, sequence is going to be most likely in this example a list, and we'll get into lists in a moment here. These are going to be statements for the loop here, and here we have yet another test condition utilizing an if statement this time. So if this basically test expression is true, then it'll break out of the loop. Here's another one utilizing a while loop. So while test expression, and then same thing, if this condition is met, it'll break out of the loop. and continue on with the component. So we're able to do it both with for and while loops as well. If we take a continue, we'll also again alter the flow of a loop, skips the code inside the loop, and it does not terminate. So slightly different configuration here. So we enter the loop, we have a test condition if it's true, and then we yet have another test condition, and if this is true, it will exit out and not perform any kind of action here. It will exit out, but it's still going to be in that particular loop. So if does condition occur, so we have actually, if you think about it, one loop over here if that condition is true, or if this condition is true and this condition is false, we have this particular loop. Once this main test expression is false, then it'll break out and then continue on with the statement there. So if we basically take a look at this code, so here we have a for loop. So we're starting out with a for, utilizing a number in a range. So whatever this is going to increment by, it's going to pass that to number. If number divided by 2 is going to have a 0 remainder, then continue. So when it continues on, it's going to say this is an even number and this is going to be the particular output. So again, we'll walk through another program in real time and see how that particular one works as well. Now this one, the pass, is actually quite unique. So when you're starting out your code and you know that you're going to have certain conditions that need to be met, but you don't have all the coding behind it, but you want to start organizing your program code. So this is basically a null, do nothing, generally utilized as a placeholder. So if we take a look at, this, we have our test expression, and we don't have any kind of data yet here, so it's a test expression. So for example, any kind of condition that we're utilizing, so if, let's say num1 is less than or equal to num2, and then we don't have any block of code yet because we're still deciding of what to do inside this block of code, we could just utilize the keyword pass, and it'll still work. There's nothing that's going to be executed, so it won't generate an error because we have this. If we did not have any code behind it, it's going to kick back and say that something is not indented correctly, and you're going to get errors in your code. So this is one way to prevent errors from displaying even though you don't have any code established. And you probably saw one of my programs that I did have a pass, and I told you to delete it while you were starting your coding project. All right, so that is it for the conditional loops.